My name is Dr. Alistair Finch. Until recently, my official designation was lead atmospheric physicist at the Anya Petrova Polar Observatory, a modest and relatively new internal research installation situated deep within the unforgiving expanse of the West Antarctic ice sheet. It is a title that now feels like a relic from a forgotten epoch, a ghost of a life that was unceremoniously snuffed out without my immediate knowledge. Our facility, a cluster of interconnected, heavily insulated modules, was designed to withstand the most ferocious tantrums the polar climate could muster. We were, by any conventional measure, among the most isolated human beings on the planet. This isolation, once a prerequisite for our pristine data collection, has become both my sanctuary and my prison. The observatory was a collaborative venture. We soon discovered why. Primarily funded by a consortium of European and North American meteorological agencies, our core mission was the study of upper atmospheric phenomena, with a particular focus on polar stratospheric clouds and their role in ozone depletion, alongside pioneering research into high-altitude cryomicrobiology, the search for microbial life surviving, even thriving, in the incredibly harsh conditions of the upper atmosphere. Samples collected by specialized high-altitude balloons. There were only 5 of us, permanently stationed here during the austral winter. Dr. Lena Hansen, our stoic Swedish glaciologist and de facto station commander, Matty Herrera, our indispensable Chilean engineer and communications technician, a man whose cheerfulness was as reliable as the diesel generators he so meticulously maintained, Dr. Kenji Tanaka, a brilliant but remarkably quiet Japanese biologist specializing in extremophiles, whose focus was mainly on sub-glacial lake samples, but who assisted with my atmospheric collections, and myself. The 5th member was Outic and General Support Officer Elias Vance, an American ex-Navy corpsman with an unnervingly calm demeanor and a surprising talent for cooking, which did wonders for morale. Life at Anya Petrova was a meticulously structured ballad of routine and scientific endeavor. The 6-month-long polar night had enveloped us nearly 3 months prior to the silence. Days, or rather, discovered why. 24-hour cycles were marked not by the sun, but by the unwavering glow of our station chronometers. My own work largely involved the monitoring of automated sensor arrays, the launching and tracking of meteorological balloons, and the painstaking analysis of the data that streamed into my laboratory. The lab itself was my haven, a small, windowless room filled with the hum of equipment and the soft glow of monitors displaying atmospheric charts, spectral analyses, and telemetry from airborne probes. The silence of the continent outside was absolute, a profound, pressing stillness that seeped into the very fabric of the station, broken only by the whisper of the ventilation system, the occasional groan of the ice under the station modules, or the distant howl of a katabatic wind. A communication with the outside world was, by necessity, limited and scheduled. We had a primary satellite uplink, capable of transmitting data packets and handling voice and video calls, though the latter were often glitchy and subject to significant latency. Matty managed this link with admirable skill, soon discovered why. wrestling with ionospheric interference and the occasional software tantrum. Personal communications were rationed to a weekly video call and a modest daily email allowance. News from the world, as we collectively referred to everything beyond the Antarctic Circle, usually arrived in condensed daily digests compiled by our respective research institutions, or through the patchy internet access Maddie could coax from the system during off-peak hours. It was, in hindsight, a comically fragile thread connecting us to the teeming, chaotic sphere of global civilization. The last normal month, as I now refer to it in my logs, was October. Spring was, in Antarctic terms, a distant concept, but the subtle shifts in atmospheric pressure and the almost imperceptible lightening of the twilight horizon during our designated daylight hours hinted at the eventual return of the sun. Lena was engrossed in analyzing ice core samples drilled earlier in the year, searching for paleoclimatic data. Kenji was meticulously preparing his equipment for the upcoming summer field season, hoping to secure a flight to a newly identified sub-glacial lake system. Maddie was performing preventative maintenance on our primary wind turbine, a colossal structure. When the winds were favorable, significantly reduced our reliance on diesel fuel. Elias was conducting his weekly medical checks and attempting, with heroic optimism, to grow some semblance of fresh herbs under grow lamps in the small hydroponics bay. My own project, the Armada, Atmospheric River Microbiology and Aerosol Dynamics Array, was yielding particularly interesting results. We had detected unusual concentrations of extremophilic bacteria at altitudes previously thought to be largely sterile. Discovered why. These were not contaminants from lower atmospheric strata. Their genetic markers were unique, suggesting an isolated, high-altitude ecosystem. I was drafting a paper, the prose stiff and academic, filled with phrases like novel bioaerosol signatures and potential implications for astrobiological analogs. It all seemed terribly important at the time. The irony is a bitter pill. The first inkling that something was amiss was subtle, easily dismissed. It was a Tuesday, or what passed for a Tuesday in our timeless existence. Maddie was scheduled for his weekly systems check with McMurdo Station, our primary logistical hub and the nearest major Antarctic base, though nearest is a relative term in this part of the world. A good 8-hour flight in a specialized sky-equipped aircraft. Weather permitting, he emerged from the communications room an hour later, a frown creasing his usually jovial features. "That's odd," he said, more to himself than to the rest of us gathered in the mess hall for our midday meal. Reconstituted stew, a staple of Ilias's winter menu. "What's up, Maddie?" Lena asked, looking up from her tablet, where she was reviewing ice-penetrating radar data. "McMurdo's comms are down." "All of them," Maddie replied, scratching his head. "Tried the primary satellite channel, then the backup Iridium link. Nothing but static. Even tried hailing them on the emergency HF bands. Dead air." A momentary silence fell over the mess hall. McMurdo was the bedrock of Antarctic operations. For their communications to go down entirely was unusual, to say the least. "Solar flare, perhaps," I offered. We had some elevated proton flux readings this morning. It was a plausible explanation. High-energy solar events could wreak havoc on satellite communications. Maddie shrugged. Could be. But it's a total blackout. Usually, even with a big flare, something gets through. Or they'd have a no-tom notice to airmen out via other channels before it hit. I'll try again in a few hours. Probably just a major technical glitch their end. They've been complaining about their aging satellite dish for years. We accepted his explanation readily enough. Antarctica teaches you a certain stoicism in the face of technical difficulties. Equipment fails. The environment is hostile. You learn to adapt, to wait, to find workarounds. The thought that this silence was anything more than a localized, temporary problem didn't even begin to form in our minds. That kind of thinking was reserved for sensationalist movies, not for seasoned researchers at the bottom of the world. Over the next 48 hours, Maddie's attempts to reach McCurdo continued to fail. He then broadened his efforts, trying to contact Scott Base, the New Zealand facility near McCurdo. Silence. Then Palmer Station on the peninsula. Nothing. Concordia Station, the Franco-Italian inland base, usually a reliable, if distant, point of contact. More silence. A prickle of unease began to penetrate my scientific detachment. Lena, ever the pragmatist, ordered Maddie to draft a summary of the situation and attempt to send it to our parent organizations in Europe and North America. The data packets were queued, their transmission indicators blinking impotently. Nothing was getting out. It's not just McCurdo, Maddie announced grimly after another fruitless 12-hour cycle in the comms room. His face was pale, his usual ebullience completely extinguished. I don't think it's us. Our systems are green across the board. Why? I've run every diagnostic. The arrays are tracking satellites as normal. But the satellites, they're just not responding. Or, rather, there's no one on the other end responding. What about the automated weather data uplinks? I asked. Many Antarctic stations, including ours, had systems that automatically transmitted meteorological data to global networks. That's the strangest part. Alistair, Maddie said, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. The automated data handshakes are failing too. It's like the entire global network is offline. The concept was so outlandish that it was difficult to process. The entire global communications network. It sounded preposterous. That can't be right, Kenji murmured, speaking for the first time in hours. He had been silently observing, his dark eyes troubled. A cascading failure of that magnitude. It's improbable. Improbable, yes, but what else fits? Elias countered, his voice calm but with an underlying tension that was new. What if it's not a technical failure? What if there's no one there to pick up the signal? His words hung in the sterile air of the station. No one there. It was a chilling thought, one that conjured images of what? A catastrophic war. A sudden, inexplicable global event. We were scientists, trained to think rationally, to seek evidence-based explanations. But we were facing a void. We soon discovered why. An utter lack of information that was more terrifying than any concrete threat. The silence from the world. once a gentle backdrop to our focused existence, was transforming into a suffocating shroud. We were truly alone. 5 souls adrift on a sea of ice, under a sky that was no longer relaying the voices of humanity. The world we knew, the one we had left behind to come to this frozen frontier, had, it seemed, simply vanished. My meticulously planned research, the academic papers, the search for microbial life in the stratosphere, it all felt profoundly, laughably irrelevant. Why? The only research that mattered now was survival, and the only data we desperately craved was a single, coherent signal from the silent, distant world. Elias's chilling question: what if there's no one there to pick up the signal?
Echoed.
In the ensuing days, a persistent, unwelcome hum beneath the station's operational noises. The immediate aftermath of realizing the totality of the communication blackout was a strange cocktail of disbelief, frenetic activity, and a creeping, insidious dread. Lena, with her characteristic pragmatism, immediately implemented emergency protocols. These were designed for scenarios like catastrophic station failure or medical evacuation, not for the sudden, inexplicable disappearance of the entire rest of the world. Nevertheless, they provided a framework, a semblance of order in the face of overwhelming uncertainty. First, a rigorous inventory of all essential supplies, food, fuel, medical provisions, and water. Though our snowmelt system was robust, fuel was the ultimate arbiter of its longevity. Elias and Kenji undertook this task with grim efficiency, their clipboards and hushed voices a counterpoint to the rising anxiety. Why? The initial assessment was reassuring, if you could call anything reassuring in our current predicament.
What happened?
We had enough freeze, dried and canned food to last at least a year, perhaps 18 months with strict rationing. Fuel for the generators, our lifeblood in the perpetual Antarctic night, was sufficient for a similar duration, provided we conserved power stringently. Medical supplies were adequate for most foreseeable emergencies, short of a catastrophic trauma requiring surgical intervention far beyond Elias's capabilities. Matty, meanwhile, became a man possessed. He barely slept, fueled by endless cups of coffee and a desperate hope. The communications room, usually just one of his many domains, became his sole outpost. He recalibrated antennas, bypassed routers, delved into the Arctic archives of our backup high-frequency radio set, a museum piece we'd only ever tested as a formality. He scanned every conceivable band, from commercial satellite frequencies to obscure military channels, even attempting to pick up amateur radio broadcasts. The other remained stubbornly, terrifyingly silent. The rhythmic hiss of static became the soundtrack to our growing despair. Anything, Matty? Anything at all? Lena would ask. Several times a day, her voice carefully neutral, betraying none of the fear that I could see tightening the skin around her eyes. And each time, Matty would shake his head, his shoulders slumping a little further. Nothing, Lena. It's like someone just threw a switch on the whole planet. I've tried bouncing signals off the moon. For God's sake, we soon discovered why. It's not just that no one's talking, the background chatter is gone too. The usual hum of global transmissions, it's just flat. My own scientific endeavors felt utterly pointless. The Armada project, my quest for high-altitude microbes, seemed like a child's game. Yet, routine was an anchor. I continued to monitor the atmospheric sensors, more out of habit than any expectation of useful data beyond our immediate weather forecasting. The data streams were nominal. The Antarctic atmosphere behaving with its usual cold indifference. The irony wasn't lost on Meg. Why? I was searching for minute traces of life in the stratosphere, while an unimaginable silence from the biosphere below consumed us. We held daily meetings in the mess hall, attempting to brainstorm, to rationalize, to find some explanation. Any explanation. That didn't involve the complete collapse of human civilization. It has to be a coordinated cyber attack. Kenji insisted during one such meeting, his voice tight. Something incredibly sophisticated, targeting global communication infrastructure. Perhaps a new form of digital warfare. But to what end, Kenji? Lena countered. Total silence. No demands, no manifestos. And to affect everything, from military satellites to civilian internet. The redundancy in those systems is immense. A solar event. I reiterated, clinging to my initial, more palatable theory. An electromagnetic pulse of unprecedented scale, frying electronics globally. Maybe one we didn't see coming, from an unexpected vector. Possible, Matty conceded, rubbing his temples. But even the most hardened military communications are shielded against EMP. Some of those should have come back online, even if sporadically. And the old analog systems, the really basic HF stuff, some of that should be chattering. Elias, who had been largely quiet, his gaze distant, finally spoke. Or it's something we haven't thought of. Something new. His voice was flat, devoid of inflection, which somehow made his words more unsettling. He had access to the same limited news digests we all did before the silence fell. We began to pore over the last few weeks of downloaded information, searching for clues we might have missed. For any news item that, in retrospect, might herald such a catastrophe. There were the usual reports of regional conflicts, political squabbles, economic anxieties. A new strain of influenza in Southeast Asia was causing concern, with higher than ever mortality rates, but it was still contained, according to the reports we had. Nothing screamed global shutdown. Nothing prepared us for this. The news items felt trivial, like dispatches from a distant, almost fictional world. The stories of stock market fluctuations and celebrity scandals seemed absurd against the backdrop of our profound isolation and the terrifying implications of the silence. The psychological toll was becoming apparent. Sleep offered little respite, often disturbed by vivid, anxious dreams. Why? The unchanging artificial light of the station, designed to combat the seasonal affective disorder of the polar night, now felt oppressive, a constant reminder of our disconnection from natural rhythms. Tempers frayed. Kenji, normally reserved, we soon discovered why, became withdrawn, spending hours staring blankly at his inactive experiment monitors. Maddie's forced optimism was cracking, revealing a raw fear. Lena maintained her composure, a pillar of strength, but I saw the effort it cost her. Elias, oddly, seemed the calmest, but it was a heavy, watchful calm that I found more disturbing than overt panic. For myself, an undercurrent of guilt began to surface. Had my obsession with my research made me blind? Had I missed some crucial atmospheric warning sign? I reviewed my recent sensor data, searching for anomalies, unusual particulate spikes, unexplained chemical signatures, anything that might correlate with a global event. There was nothing beyond the expected parameters for our region. The Antarctic air was, as always, the cleanest on Earth, or so I thought. The first concrete, terrifying piece of the puzzle arrived not through the silent radios, but through one of my own high-altitude atmospheric sampling balloons. It was a routine launch, part of the now defunct Armada project. The balloon ascended to its target altitude of 30 kilometers, collected its stratospheric air samples, and then, as programmed, vented helium and began its descent, parachute deploying. Why? We typically recovered these payloads via a tracked snowmobile once they landed, sometimes a considerable distance from the station. This particular balloon, Armada 17, had drifted further east than usual due to uncharacteristically strong jet stream winds. Its telemetry indicated a landing approximately 80 kilometers away, in a region of sastrugi fields, wave-like ridges of hard snow formed by the wind, making ground travel treacherous. Normally, we soon discovered, with the world functioning, we might have waited for clearer satellite imagery, or better weather, or even requested aerial support for a distant recovery. But now any potential source of information, however remote, felt critical. Lena, after a brief discussion, agreed. Maddie, desperate for any activity that wasn't staring at silent radio consoles, volunteered to go, and I, as the principal investigator for the payload, insisted on accompanying him. Elias, with his medical skills, was the logical third. Lena and Kenji would remain to monitor the station. The journey in the heated cabin of our tracked vehicle, a robust H. Giglin's type carrier we called the Mole, was slow and bone-jarring. The perpetual twilight outside was broken only by our powerful headlights cutting through the blowing snow. The GPS, thankfully a self-contained system relying on its own satellite constellation, which, mysteriously, still seemed to be functional for positioning, though not for communication, guided us towards the balloon's last reported coordinates. After nearly 6 hours of careful navigation through the ice fields, Maddie, who was driving, slowed the Mole to a halt. "Beacon signal is strong. Should be just over this ridge," he said, his voice tinny over the vehicle's internal comms. We disembarked, bundled in our extreme cold weather gear, faces protected by masks and goggles. The wind was sharp, carrying fine ice particles that stung any exposed skin. The temperature was a biting -50 degrees Celsius. As we crested the ridge, our headlamps illuminated the scene. The orange parachute was stark against the endless white, and the instrument package, a reinforced container, about the size of a small suitcase, lay on its side. But it wasn't the payload that seized my attention. It was what lay around it. Scattered in a rough circle, partially covered by drifting snow, were birds. Dozens of them. Squaws. Mostly, those hardy, predatory seabirds of the Antarctic coasts. But we were hundreds of kilometers inland, far from their usual coastal habitats, and they weren't just dead. They were beak contorted, necks bent at unnatural angles, wings splayed, their dark eyes milky and staring. Some looked as if they had simply fallen from the sky mid-flight. What in God's name? Matty breathed, his voice hushed in awe and horror. Ilias knelt, cautiously approaching one of the frozen birds, his gloved hand reaching out, then hesitating. "They're not just frozen," he said, his voice tight. "Look at the tissue around the eyes, the beak some kind of rapid desiccation or necrosis. And this isn't normal predation." I moved towards the instrument package, my scientific training kicking in, trying to suppress the rising tide of revulsion, the air sampler, the intake ports. If these birds had died here, recently, whatever killed them might have been in the air. But this was far beyond any atmospheric toxin I could conceive of. This was biological, visceral. As I unlatched the payload, casing to retrieve the internal sample containers and data logger, I noticed something else. A fine, almost invisible dark residue was coating the upward facing surfaces of the instrument package, a faint dusting that was absent on the sides sheltered by its landing orientation. It was not snow. It was too dark, too fine. I carefully scraped a minuscule amount onto a sterile collection slide I kept in my field kit. We gathered what we could. The grim tableau of the dead birds seared into our minds. The return journey to Anya Petrova was mostly silent. The usual banter replaced by a heavy apprehension. Back in my lab, under the microscope, the dark residue revealed its nature. It wasn't mineral dust, nor volcanic ash. It was organic. Spores, I thought initially. But they were unlike any fungal or bacterial spores I had ever seen. They were irregularly shaped, with tiny, hair-like filaments. And some appeared to be clumped, as if aggregated by some unknown binding agent. But it was the primary air sample from Armaga 17, collected at 30 kilometers altitude, that delivered the truly devastating blow. The automated bio-sensor suite within the payload had flagged an anomaly even before I ran my more detailed analysis. When I processed the sample through our onboard spectrometer and electron microscope, my blood ran cold. Mixed with the usual sparse collection of extremophilic bacteria and cosmic dust were those same unfamiliar organic particles, but in much higher concentrations than the residue on the casing. And among them, something else. Fragments. Microscopic fragments of what appeared to be cellular material, but degraded, almost shredded. And within several of those fragments, barely identifiable, were viral capsids of a type I had never encountered. Complex and unsettlingly uniform. The implications were monstrous. Something had been in the high stratosphere. Something organic. And something that was associated with widespread, violent death, at least in avian species. Discovered why. Something that could be carried on the global atmospheric currents. I presented my findings to the others that evening. The images from the electron microscope glowed on the main display screen in the mess hall. The dead squaws. The unknown spores. The viral fragments. The room was silent for a long time. So, it came from the air. Lena finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. Potentially, I replied, my own voice hoarse. Or it was spread by something that moves through the air. If this is widespread in the upper atmosphere, it could explain the global nature of the silence. A pathogen, perhaps, distributed globally by the jet streams, then falling to Earth. A pathogen that kills everything. That silences global communications big by killing the operators. Maddie's voice cracked. Kenji, the biologist, looked green. The bird's the necrosis. It suggests something incredibly aggressive. Something that overwhelms the host rapidly. He paused, then added, and if it affects birds. He didn't need to finish the sentence. The implication was clear. If it affected birds, it could very likely affect mammals. It could affect humans. The silence from the world suddenly had a new, terrifyingly plausible explanation. It wasn't a solar flare, nor a cyber attack. It was a plague. Why? A plague that had apparently swept the globe with horrifying speed and efficiency, leaving an entire planet silent in its wake. And we, in our isolated polar, haven't had, by sheer geographic lottery, missed its opening act. The question that now burned in all our minds was, were we merely delayed, or had we truly been spared? And what horrors had unfolded in that silent wood beyond our frozen sanctuary? The dead birds were a grim omen. A message from a dying planet delivered to our doorstep. The revelation that we were likely survivors of a global pandemic. One that had operated with terrifying speed and silence. Plunged Ania Petrova Polar Observatory into a new level of grim reality. The images of the dead squaws, their bodies twisted in unnatural agony. We soon discovered why, and the microscopic photographs of the alien-looking spores and viral fragments became the unwelcome centerpiece of our existence. Fear, which had been a generalized anxiety about the unknown, now coalesced into a specific, chilling dread the air itself. The very substance that sustained us might be a carrier of unimaginable death. Lena, ever decisive, immediately instituted a stringent lockdown protocol. All non-essential outdoor excursions were forbidden. The air filtration systems, already robust for polar conditions, were pushed to their maximum capacity. Their filters checked and re-checked with an almost obsessive fervor by Maddie. Anyone who had been part of the Armanga 17 recovery team, myself, Maddie, and Elias underwent a period of heightened observation. Though our medical bay was hardly equipped for advanced pathogen detection, we monitored our temperatures, reported any cough or ached, however slight, with a paranoia that was palpable. Every sniffle, every moment of fatigue, became a source of intense internal debating. Was it the omnipresent dry air of the station, the stress, or was it? Kenji, our biologist, became the reluctant focus of our desperate hope for understanding. He transformed a section of his lab, normally dedicated to extremophile bacteria from sub-glacial ice, into a makeshift containment zone. Discovered why. Using the samples I had collected from the payload and the dead birds, he worked tirelessly, pushing the limits of our modest equipment. He attempted to culture the strange spores, to isolate and identify the viral fragments. But our resources were designed for environmental microbiology, not cutting-edge virology or pathology. The spores are ripe inert, at least in any growth medium I can provide, he reported after several days of intense work, his face etched with fatigue and frustration. They don't replicate, they don't metabolize in any way I can detect. It's possible they require a specific host environment, or perhaps what we're seeing are the spent vectors, the delivery system, not the active agent itself. He gestured to the electron microscope images. And these viral fragments, their structure is complex, unlike anything in our databases, without genetic sequencing capabilities, which are far beyond us here. Identifying their origin or exact nature is impossible. All I can say is that the cellular degradation in the avian tissue samples is extraordinarily rapid and aggressive. It's not just cell death, it's almost like a liquefaction at a microscopic level. His words offered little comfort. Why? The pathogen remained an enigma, a shadowy predator whose characteristics we could only guess at. The question of its transmission vector was paramount. If it was airborne and still present, were our station's filters enough? The filters were designed to remove particulates, dust, ice crystals, even bacteria, but a viral agent, or these unknown micro-spores, if they were small enough, could theoretically pose a challenge. The station, once a haven of scientific collaboration, began to feel smaller, the recycled air thicker with unspoken fears. The five of us, thrown together by professional ambition, now found ourselves bound by a shared, terrifying fate. The unspoken question hung over every meal, every terse conversation. Were we simply delaying the inevitable? Why? The debate about our next of action began subtly, then grew into the dominant topic of our daily meetings. Do we stay put at Anya Petrova, our known sanctuary with its finite resources? Or do we risk the unknown and attempt to reach a larger potential later? Equipped, base, like McMurdo. Staying here is a slow death. Sentence if that stuff is still in the air. Or if our supplies run out before anything changes. Matty argued, his voice strained. He had taken to constantly checking the external atmospheric particulate sensors, his anxiety manifesting as a restless energy. McMurdo is a small city compared to this place. They'll have better medical facilities, more supplies, maybe even answers. Or other survivors. If McMurdo still exists in any functional capacity, Lena countered, her pragmatism a heavy counterweight. We have zero indication that it, or any other station, fared better than the rest of the world. For all we know, it's a charnel house. The journey itself is incredibly hazardous, especially with winter drawing to a close and the summer melt season potentially making overland travel even more unpredictable. And if the pathogen is airborne, as Alistair's findings suggest, we'd be exposing ourselves with every kilometer. I found myself torn. The scientist in me craved more data, but the rational part recognized the extreme danger. The concentration of those particles was highest in the stratosphere. I reasoned. Why? It's possible the primary wave, a fallout, has already occurred. What we found on the payload casing could be residual. The question is, how long does it remain viable in the surface air? And in what concentrations? These were questions we had no way of answering. Elias, who had been listening intently, finally weighed in, his voice carrying its usual unnerving calm. Why? There is also the possibility that the pathogen is not the only threat. If society has collapsed as completely as the silence suggests, the dangers out there might not just be biological. He didn't elaborate, but his meaning was clear: desperation, lawlessness, the unpredictable actions of other potential survivors. His words painted a grim picture of a world torn apart. Kenji, ever cautious, sided with Lena. Our best chance, logically, is to remain here, conserve resources, and maintain the integrity of our controlled environment. We are isolated. That is our greatest advantage. To abandon that for an unknown, potentially hostile environment seems ill-advised. The impasse was stressful. We were a team. But this was a decision with life or death stakes, and consensus was elusive. For weeks, we maintained our cautious routine. The debate simmering, our hopes for any external signal dwindling to nothing. Maddie still manned the comms room for hours each day, a ritual of fading hope. The silence from the world remained absolute. Then, one evening, discovered why. During what would have been the late night shift for European monitoring stations, something changed. Maddie came bursting into the mess hall where Lena, Kenji, and I were having a subdued discussion about optimizing our hydroponics to supplement our food stores. Elias was, as he often was lately, in the medical bay, ostensibly organizing supplies, but, I suspected, also seeking solitude. "I've got something?" Matty yelled, his face flushed, eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and terror. It's weak, fragmented, but it's there, an automated emergency broadcast. We scrambled after him to the communications room. The main speaker, why, usually filled with the monotonous hiss of cosmic background radiation, now emitted a sputtering, heavily distorted signal. It was a looped message, barely intelligible through layers of static and interference. Spoken in English, but with a strange, monotone cadence, as if generated by a primitive text-to-speech system. EP, warning: containment failure protocol 7 activated, biohazard level 4, BU static crackle. A, all metropolitan zones compromised, and U hiss. Pops and BU infected, seek personnel. Seek a Mediterranean shelter or remotic. Mo crackling. Non-terrestrial extraction points, do not, I repeat, do not approach the infected. They are a long burst of static, then a change in tone. Almost a distorted scream. Behungric quarantine zones are overrun, W statics in. By hostelec they are still mobilip. The message repeated. Why? A horrifying loop of fragmented warnings. Each repetition seemed to solidify the dread in the room. Biohazard level 4. Lena breathed, her face pale. That's the highest. Ebola. Lassa fevered, things that are lethal and highly transmissible. Uninfected personnel, seek subterranean shelter. I repeated, the words feeling like ice in my veins. Non-terrestrial extraction points. What does that even mean? Spacecraft. Kenji was staring at the speaker, his expression one of utter horror. Why? Do not approach the infected, they are hostile. They are still mobile. He looked at us, his eyes wide with a dawning, terrible understanding that mirrored my own. It's not just a plague that kills. The infected, they remain active, hostile. The word, zombie, wasn't spoken, not then. It was too outlandish, too rooted in fiction. But the implications of the garbled message were unavoidable. This wasn't just a disease that killed and then was done. This was something else. Something that left its victims changed. Mobile, hostile, hungry. The dead squaws suddenly took on an even more sinister light. Were they just dead? Or could a pathogen that reanimates, or fundamentally alters, its host operate across species? The thought was nightmarish. Maddie frantically tried to clean up the signal, to isolate its origin, but it was too weak. Too corrupted by its journey through a presumably shattered global communication network. It seemed to be a continental or global emergency broadcast system, perhaps triggered automatically in the initial stages of the outbreak and now slowly failing as its power sources depleted. Mobile, Elias said, appearing silently in the doorway, drawn by the commotion. He had heard the last few loops of the broadcast. His face, usually impassive, was tight with a grim understanding. That explains the completeness of the silence. If the dead don't stay dead, the last vestiges of hope that this was some survivable, albeit catastrophic, natural disaster began to crumble. What we were facing was not just the collapse of civilization, but potentially the rise of something monstrous, something that actively hunted the living. Our isolation at Anya Petrova, once a scientific boon, and then a shield against a passive plague, now felt like a fragile bubble in an ocean of unimaginable horrors. The question of stay or go suddenly had a new, terrifying dimension. If we stayed, were we merely waiting for our supplies to dwindle? The infected world festered outside. If we went, what were we going towards? The garbled message offered no solace, only a confirmation of our deepest fears and the introduction of new, even more terrible possibilities. The Antarctic wind, howling outside the station, seemed to carry echoes of that broken, desperate warning. The world hadn't just died. It had become a hunting ground. And we were, for now, 5 isolated prey, wondering if the hunters would ever find their way to our frozen, silent corner of the earth. The fragmented, terrifying broadcast irrevocably altered the atmosphere at Anya Petrova. The abstract fear of a pathogen became the concrete horror of hostile, mobile infected. The word, zombie, though still feeling absurdly cinematic, began to whisper at the edges of our conversations. An unspoken acknowledgement of the grotesque, reality hinted at by the stuttering emergency transmission. Sleep became a minefield of fractured nightmares, and waking hours were saturated with a tense, hyper-vigilant awareness. Every creak of the station, every flicker of the lights, seemed amplified, potentially heralding an unseen threat. Kenji, our biologist, became even more withdrawn, discovered. Poring over the limited data we had on the atmospheric particles and the avian tissue samples, he began to theorize that spores I'd identified might not be the primary infectious agent, but perhaps a catalyst or a carrier for the viral fragments. We soon discovered why, explaining their inertness in his cultures but their presence at the scene of the birds' rapid demise. If the virus causes rapid cellular degradation and neural aggression, he postulated during one strained meal, and these spore-like structures facilitate its dispersal and resilience in extreme environments. Like the stratosphere, it's a terrifyingly efficient delivery system for a global alteration event. Alteration event, he called it. We soon discovered a clinical detached term for what sounded increasingly like the end of humanity as we knew it. The debate about leaving Anya Petrova reignited with desperate urgency. Maddie, previously an advocate for heading to McMurdo, was now gripped by a new terror. If those things are mobile, McMurdo could be a death trap. A whole station full of them. We're safer here isolated. We have walls, limited access points. Lena, however, found her resolve hardening in the opposite direction. Or supplies are finite, Maddie. That hasn't changed. If the infected are indeed mobile and potentially hunting, what happens when our fuel runs out? When our food dwindles? We become sitting ducks, trapped in a dying station. McMurdo, if any part of it is secure, or if there are other survivors, represents a chance, however slim, of long-term sustainability, perhaps even information, or a means of wider contact. Should anyone be left to contact? Elias, surprisingly, sided with Lena, though his reasoning was characteristically bleak. If the world has fallen to this extent, then nowhere is truly safe indefinitely. Anya Petrova is a temporary refuge at best. The primary threat, as I see it, is not just the infected, but the slow decay of our ability to survive here. A larger base might offer more resources to leverage, or at least a clear picture of the true scale of the catastrophe. Staying here is a passive gamble. Leaving is an active one. I'd rather choose my gamble. I found myself agreeing with Lena and Elias. The thought of huddling in our small station, waiting for our resources to deplete while a world of horrors roamed outside, felt like a slower, more agonizing form of defeat. However, the journey would be perilous beyond measure, but it felt marginally more productive than simply waiting. The decision was cemented by an event that had nothing to do with the infected, but everything to do with the harsh realities of Antarctic survival. One of our primary diesel generators, Gen Alpha, began to show signs of catastrophic failure. Matty worked on it tirelessly for 2 straight days, his face smudged with grease and etched with worry, but the diagnosis was grim. A critical bearing was shot, and we lacked the specialized tools and a replacement part of that size. Gen Bravo, our backup, was functional, but it was older, less efficient, and would consume our carefully hoarded fuel at an alarming rate if it became our sole source of power. Our wind turbine, though helpful, was intermittent, entirely dependent on the notoriously fickle Antarctic gales. With Gen Alpha down, our projected fuel endurance is cut by at least 40%. Matty announced, his voice heavy with defeat. We have months, not a year or more. Maybe less if we have a harsh, windless period. That was the tipping point. Why? Our haven was no longer sustainable in the long term. The gamble of staying had just become significantly worse. Preparations for departure began immediately, a whirlwind of grim, focused activity. Our destination, McMurdo Station. It was the largest, most resource-rich Antarctic base, and if there was any semblance of order or a significant group of survivors, it would be there. Our mode of transport, the Molly, our tracked H-Igloon's vehicle, the same one that had taken us to the site of the dead squaws. It was reliable, heated, and had a modest cargo capacity. We would load it with as much fuel, food, essential scientific equipment, including my atmospheric sampler and Kenji's microscope. Information was still a precious commodity. Medical supplies, and whatever rudimentary defensive tools we could improvise. Elias, with his military background, took charge of the latter fashion-heavy duty ice axes and sharpened steel poles from workshop materials. Why? They looked pitifully inadequate against the imagined horrors, but they were something. The final days at Anya Petrova were somber. We went through the shutdown procedures for the station, a place that had been our home, our world, for so many months. It felt like abandoning a sinking ship, but also like shedding a skin that had grown too tight, too suffocating. My lab, with its now silent instruments and stacks of irrelevant research, felt like a tomb dedicated to a lost era of scientific inquiry. The morning of our departure was bleak, even by Antarctic standards. A low, gray sky pressed down, and a light, persistent snowfall reduced visibility. The five of us, bundled in our warmest gear, stood for a moment looking at the silent, snow-dusted modules of Anya Petrova. No words were spoken. There was nothing left to say. Matty took the driver's seat in the mole, his knuckles white on the controls. Lena sat beside him, navigating. Kenji, Elias, and I were in the rear compartment, surrounded by our precious cargo. The rhythmic rumble of the diesel engine a fragile heartbeat against the immense silence of the continent. The journey was arduous from the outset. The terrain, even on established GPS routes between inland stations and McMurdo, routes primarily used by heavy traverse convoys in summer, was challenging for our single vehicle. Hidden crevices, fields of sharp sastrugi, and patches of soft snow that threatened to bog us down were constant hazards. Progress was painstakingly slow. We drove in shifts, the perpetual twilight outside offering no respite, no true sense of day or night. Inside the mole, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Every unusual sound from the engine, every unexpected lurch of the vehicle, sent a jolt of anxiety through us. We scanned the desolate landscape through the reinforced windows, half expecting to see something, but there was only the endless, indifferent white. The silence on the radio, which Matty still monitored out of habit, remained absolute. It was on the fourth day of our journey, as we were navigating a vast, featureless ice plain known as the Titan's dance floor, that we saw the first sign that we were no longer alone in our desolation, and that the horrors were not confined to distant continents. Lena, who was observing through binoculars, suddenly gasped, "What is that?" Off to starboard, about 2 kilometers out. Matty slowed the mole. We all strained to see. At first, it was just a dark smudge against the snow, difficult to discern in the flat light. As we cautiously approached, the smudge resolved into a shape. It was a vehicle, another tracked carrier, smaller than ours, Perhaps a science team's field vehicle, overturned and partially buried in a snowdrift. This deep inland, any vehicle was likely from another research station. Anyone see any movement? Elias asked, his voice low, his hand instinctively going to one of the sharpened poles. We observed for a full 10 minutes. Nothing. We should check it out, Lena said finally. Servers, supplies, information. The decision was fraught, but the potential for supplies or information was too great to ignore. Elias and I, armed with our makeshift weapons and a first aid kit, volunteered to approach, while Lena kept the mole's engine running, ready for a quick retreat. Maddie and Kenji watched, their faces pale, through the vehicle's windows. As we drew closer, a sense of profound wrongness emanated from the wreck. There were no footprints around it, save for our own approaching tracks. The silence was absolute. Not even the wind seemed to stir here. The vehicle was lying on its side, one track assembly torn away. The cockpit canopy was shattered. Elias motioned for me to stay back, while he cautiously approached the broken canopy. He peered inside, then recoiled, a muffled sound of disgust escaping him. He waved me forward, his face grim. I looked. The interior was a scene of frozen, grotesque carnage. Two figures, clad in Antarctic gear, were slumped inside, but they were torn. Not by the crash, it seemed, but by something else. Blood, frozen black, was everywhere, and the bodiest parts of them were missing. Rents in their clothing showing exposed, gnawed bone. But the most horrifying detail was a third figure. It was outside the vehicle, half buried in the snow a few meters away, as if it had been thrown clear or had crawled out. It was frozen solid, of course, but its posture was one of arrested motion. One arm outstretched, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, jaw agape in a silent scream. Its eyes, wide and milky, were fixed on the sky. And around its mouth and on its hands, dark stains that could only be frozen blood. We soon discovered why. It wasn't wearing the same heavy gear as the figures in the cockpit. Its clothing was thinner, torn, as if it had been a passenger. They weren't just killed by the crash. I whispered, the words catching in my throat, the frigid air burning my lungs. Something attacked them. Org one of thing. Elias nodded grimly. The one outside it looked at its hands, its mouth. It looks like it was feeding. The implications hit us with the force of a physical blow. The broadcast wasn't just a warning. It was an understatement. The pathogen, the alteration, it was here, in Antarctica. It wasn't a distant threat filtering down from the stratosphere. We soon discovered why. It was already among the isolated pockets of humanity at the bottom of the world. Had these people succumbed to the airborne plague and then turned on each other? Or had they encountered something else? We found no usable supplies, no logs, nothing but the frozen tableau of death and horror. We retreated to the mole. The image of the frozen, gaping figure seared into our minds. The silence in our vehicle was heavier than ever before. McMurdo, our beacon of hope, now seemed less like a sanctuary and more like a potential epicenter of this Antarctic strain of the global nightmare. We pressed on, our previous anxieties now magnified 100-fold. The vast, empty continent no longer felt empty. It felt like it was watching us, holding its breath. We were truly on our own. 5 tiny sparks of fading warmth and sanity in an encroaching, frozen hell. The start of the zombie apocalypse we had missed from our isolated perch was no longer a distant news report. It was here, etched in frozen blood in the snow, and its icy fingers were slowly, inexorably, reaching out for us. Our journey had just begun. We soon discovered. But the horrifying truth was dawning: we hadn't just missed the start of the apocalypse. We were now driving directly into its silent, frozen heart. The world we knew was gone, replaced by a chilling, predatory emptiness. And the Antarctic silence was no longer a comfort, but a terrifying, pregnant pause.